Hello, everyone. The purpose of this video is to talk to you a little bit about artificial intelligence. In the last few years, there have been some major strides in what artificial intelligence can do and what it looks like in our lives, and certainly how it affects a class like English 101. So let's get started. First of all, what is artificial intelligence? If you didn't know, it's actually been around for a little while, but it just doesn't look like the way that it looks like today. So historically, we have used artificial intelligence whenever we've interacted with a chat bot. Like if you go to return something on Amazon and it suggests a little help chat bot. When you use Grammarly, so if you ever use Grammarly to correct your spelling or grammar, or if you use that kind of tool in Word or Google Docs or whatever you're using, that's artificial intelligence. And last but not least, when we talk to Siri or Alexa on our devices, that's artificial intelligence. So we have had this integrated into our lives. But there's a new type that came out just a few years ago called generative AI. And the type of generative AI that we are going to talk about in this class is large language models. There are other types. There's image producing generative AI, there's video producing generative AI. But for our purposes for English 1, we're talking about LLMs, okay? So those are specifically the generative AI models that produce text. And you might think of something like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Claude, and there's a few more, although these are kind of the top three, the big names right now in the generative AI large language models. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. Now, it's important to know, what can these LLMs, these large language models, do? Basically, what they do is they recognize, summarize, translate, predict, and generate content using very large data sets. So you can think of it this way. They've kind of been fed like the internet, okay? They have a ton of information at their disposal. And what they're doing when you ask them a question or ask them to produce something is they are looking for similar patterns of words online. So they can't actually think, but they are looking for, what are the patterns of what your question is? What are you asking me about? And what do I see out there in my data set, what I've been fed? That I can pull from to answer that. Okay. The way they work actually is to predict and generate the next best logical word based on existing patterns. So if you have ever started typing a text and there's like a little, is this the next word kind of suggestion hovering there? Or if you start typing an email, they do that now where they'll suggest like the next string of words. That's exactly how these LLMs work. They're a very sophisticated autocomplete. So when you ask it a question, they're saying, oh, what typically completes this answer, right? Online. They're not evaluating it for accuracy. They're not thinking about it, okay? Even though it's deceptive, it seems like they're thinking about it. They're pulling information that other humans have posted online at one point in time, that's in its data set to answer that, okay? So you can see where some problems might arise here, but most of the time it works pretty well, right? Pretty good at copying existing text. They can summarize well. So if you ask it to summarize something for you, particularly Gemini now and Google, is pretty accurate. They can create citations. So if you ask it to format something in APA, MLA, it's pretty accurate, although you can't trust it 100% of the time. And the sources themselves are not always accurate, but it could maybe help you with like formatting something, okay? And they're good at pulling information from the web. So all of the models that we talked about now are able to pull information from the web. That wasn't always true, but for the most part now, they are working with like live information, stuff that's recently been published online. So if you ask ChatGPT about the news of the day, it can go through sort of like a Google response and say, here's what's the latest on this particular topic. Okay, now there are certain things that they cannot do, and that's really important to know because as you interact with them, you don't just want to blindly trust them, okay? Just like you wouldn't blindly trust Reddit, okay? You don't want to blindly trust everything that these things spit out. First of all, they cannot create an original thought. So they have no original thoughts of their own. They're only copying what's already been put out there. And as you can imagine, this has caused some problems. In fact, a lot of legal problems because these are people's real thoughts and writing online that they're sort of taking from, okay? Sometimes with permission, sometimes without permission. most of the time, it seems like, without permission nowadays. So that's created this huge problem. This is like one of the foremost issues with these things is that they're just sort of stealing work without giving credit where credit is due, without giving credit to the source, the person who wrote it. And you can imagine how you would feel if that happened to you, right? You spent a lot of time and effort on an idea, and then, it just gets stolen by a machine and you don't get the credit as the machine gives the information out. Okay, so it's not thinking, it's just spitting back out. It cannot distinguish fact from fiction. Now they're working on this. This is getting better. A few years ago, if you asked ChatGPT to write an essay about, the Earth being flat, it would spit it right out. Right? Here's my flat Earth theory. But now they have like guardrails up where they say like, okay, common sense, maybe you shouldn't be able to do that, or you should have a disclosure saying like, this is not actually a fact. We know that the Earth is round, that kind of thing. But in general, they themselves, these LLMs, cannot distinguish fact from fiction. So if you ask it something, and it's pulling an answer from somewhere that's not reliable. As of last year, 2024, ChatGPT, the main source of information was Reddit. Okay. So, you're not always going to get a great answer from these things. Okay. It cannot tell you where it got its information reliably. This is another one that they're working on. This is getting better every year, probably every few months, it's getting better, where it might be able to tell you like a source where it pulled this information from, like an article or something, if you ask it. Okay, so it's not necessarily automatically going to tell you like whose information it's sort of borrowing or stealing without credit, right? But it can tell you if you ask it, and it may be reliable. You got to check on that. Okay. They cannot solve moral problems, so they're actually really bad at this. This has been part of the problem with self-driving cars for a long time, was like building in all these decision-making abilities. Okay, so what do I do if, there's an old lady crossing the road, and a van next to me with kids in it, and I'm gonna hit one or the other, right? You would have to program that into the model of the self-driving car to say, okay, what do I do? A human is just going to react how they react and try to avoid the situation totally, right? Try to avoid hitting both. But if the AI model knows that there's kids in the car next to them, because it can see that, right? It might go and hit the old lady who's crossing the road because the kids are younger, right? So these kinds of things are hard to program into an artificial intelligence model. Okay. It cannot contextualize highly rhetorical situations. All right. So if you have a very sensitive situation with a colleague, let's say somebody you work with, you need to stay on good terms with them, but you've been asked to tell them unpleasant news. They're not doing a good job of something. You as a human being are going to be much better at sort of navigating that, knowing the other person, knowing what needs to be said, what needs to not be said in that situation. An LLM is always going to spit out a more generic version of like, here's what you should say. And humans are better at that. We just are. When we know somebody, we're better at that. Okay. It cannot replace your critical thinking skills. Remember, it itself is not thinking in the first place, but certainly don't let it replace your own thoughts. Okay. And there's a real danger here. Like, we are moving forward into more and more artificial intelligence. And I'm certainly not anti-artificial intelligence as a whole. Like, I'm not like, you can't ever use it. We are using it, like it's here, right? When I do a Google search, Gemini answers now. So it's integrated into our life, but don't let it think for you, particularly in a class like this. Okay. Last but not least, it cannot give you an unbiased opinion. So AI, we know, has an algorithmic bias towards white male native English speakers. All right. And the reason for this is because large swaths of what has been fed was written by white male native English speakers. Not that there's anything wrong with that perspective. There's not. That's a perfectly valid perspective. But you can imagine that if you're asking it about something that is a woman's issue, it might sort of leave some important stuff out if it's not giving a balanced perspective of what women think about this, or what different ethnicities or backgrounds might think about something. So just be careful. You don't want it to replace your voice. And that is something to be aware of moving forward with using these generative AI models, is that they're only representing a segment of the population. They're working towards getting better at this, but that means that we need to hear, from everybody. We need to hear everybody's voice in writing. We need to know what different folks think. Okay. Last but not least, there is something called hallucinations. If you haven't heard of this, it's false information produced by a large language model like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. Um, they're not lying to you on purpose. Like, these models are not thinking like, oh, I'm not going to tell them the right answer. They don't have any thought like that. But what's happened is you've asked it a question, you've asked it to write something, and it pulls from Reddit or wherever else it sees those language patterns happening that you asked it, and then it spits out false information. So the hallucination rate is going down each year, but it's still significant, particularly with ChatGPT and Gemini. I would be careful, okay? I can guarantee you it will give you the wrong information a certain percentage of the time. This just happened to me like 3 days ago, okay? I'm talking 2025 here. I plugged something into ChatGPT. I asked it to give me a certain response. It gave me the literal opposite. And I said, you messed that up. I checked my prompt, like what I fed it. And I asked it for something and it gave me the opposite. And I said, hey, you gave me the opposite. And it said, oh, whoops, sorry. Here's the right thing that you asked for. So it's again, not thinking about it. It just happens. Okay. So I wanted to show you some examples. These are from just a few months ago. They're basically things that people fed into generative AI and it spit out some unreliable information, okay? So this person asked, how many rocks shall I eat? And the AI said, at least one small rock per day, according to researchers, okay? They're a vital source of minerals and vitamins for digestive health. Definitely not true, okay? Smoking while pregnant. Doctors recommend smoking 2 to 3 cigarettes per day during pregnancy. Okay, and you can see the date on here. This is 2024, okay? And last but not least, someone said, is it okay to drink on antibiotics? And the AI said, yes, it's generally recommended to drink while on antibiotics. Yippee! Okay. So you can see it's literally pulling information from the web or wherever it's been fed, and it's just spitting it back out. Okay. So these examples are funny because we know that they're wrong. Like, this is common knowledge. It's not hard to tell. But what happens when it's something that you don't actually know the answer to, right? That's where the danger comes in. So what happens when it's something not ridiculous? How do we know what's true? How do we know what's missing? And particularly what's missing. I want to show you this article that came out on AI and bias. It says humans are biased, generative AI is even worse. And this has to do with like leaving out certain voices, okay? Basically, AI can only pull from what it's been fed. And if it hasn't been fed equally across different perspectives, which it hasn't, it's going to spit out biased information. And we know that humans are biased, right? Biases are, exist everywhere. But generative AI is even worse. It exacerbates stereotypes. So if you want to take a look at this article, I have it linked on Blackboard, okay? And it basically tells you what kinds of biases generative AI has according to skin color, according to gender, okay? So it's assuming that high-paying occupations here are owned by mostly people of light-colored skin, and you can see that lower-paying jobs, it has a greater distribution there. It also assumes that men primarily are architects, lawyers, politicians, doctors, CEOs, judges, and engineers. Look, there's almost no women. This light color represents women. That's a little depressing because it is worse than the human reality, okay? So yes, some of these jobs have a male, there's more males working in them than females, but it's not as bad as what these charts show. And moreover, humans themselves don't assume this stuff. Like, if I talked to you all, you wouldn't assume that, for every 100 engineers, there's only going to be one woman, or women can't be engineers or something ridiculous like that, right? You wouldn't assume that. Most people don't. So generative AI is even worse. So if people are relying on this generative AI for ideas, for understandings of the world, that's where this danger comes in, okay? So that's why I want to impress upon you that your voice, particularly in writing, is still important. Okay, it's very important. Do not let yourself be erased by generative AI, particularly if you don't identify as, the voice that it's writing in. And I certainly don't. I'm a woman, right? So, and if you're not a native English speaker or whatever your background is, all of that informs you. And if you are the dominant voice of generative AI, you still have your own perspectives that are different than what generative AI is going to spit out, right? It's just borrowing from what's already been written. Your voice is still so important in writing. And I want to get to know that voice and what you have to say in this class, because your voice adds perspective, it adds validity, it shares your experiences, and only you can speak from those experiences. And that's so important. Okay. I want to show you a couple of quotes. This one is from Dr. Yann LeCun. He's one of the foremost experts on generative AI. And he writes that people sometimes feel threatened by the fact that at some point in the future, AI systems will be smarter than us. He says there's no question this will happen. We have to get used to this idea. Machines will get smarter than us in all the domains where we are smart, and probably in other domains that we can't even fathom. Now, do we feel threatened by this, or do we feel empowered by it? If those systems are under our control, then that's empowering. To me, that's a pretty big if, right? If they stay under our control. So my encouragement to you, and the reason I'm sharing this, is to not let generative AI or any large language model or any AI replace your own critical thinking. Don't let it replace your experience. Don't let it do all the thinking for you, okay? You have a unique perspective. Your own critical thinking is so valuable, and you have so much to add to this class. My students are the best part of the class, the best part of the job, and part of that is getting to know you through your writing and your perspective. Doctors V and LaQuintano shared this last year. The goal of writing classes is to help you express ideas, engage with other ideas, think critically about text, learn to read mindfully, and so on. Writing is a subtle and powerful skill, and it takes a long time to learn to do well. Taking shortcuts may help you in the short term, but have repercussions in the long term for your motivation, ability to communicate, connect with others, or work productively. So in other words, letting LLMs, do the writing for you or do the thinking for you, might like have a shortcut in the short term, but it really does hurt us in the long term personally. And then, globally as well, like what we're moving towards with this AI, okay? So I have a few questions for you to think about, and you can explore some of these in your assignment this week on Blackboard. The first question is, what does your voice in writing sound like? So your voice means like that perspective that you bring, what you sound like when you write it out, right? And I'm not looking for perfection here, like total polished everything. What I'm looking for is what you actually sound like. Like I love it when I can hear a student voice in their writing. So part of what adds to our voice is our identity, right? What perspectives do we uniquely bring to the table? For me, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I am someone who's been to school forever. I spent 11 years between undergraduate and graduate school, in school as a student, a working student, working full time. So that informs who I am, right? I know what that's like. I bring that to the table. I'm from New Jersey originally, so maybe I have some perspectives that are unique there. I'm certainly an American citizen, right? So I have that perspective. Maybe you have political beliefs or things that help inform who you are and what you have to say and what you bring into the world and into this course. Think about, why is it important that people hear you, okay? To me, it's extremely important that every single one of you are heard, okay? And that you don't let something else take the place of your voice. It's so valuable, okay? Whether generative AI contains your perspective or not, you're going to say it in a new way. You have a unique perspective that generative AI does not, okay? And that's extremely valuable for humanity and for our course. How does writing something out help you think through it? We know that research shows writing is part of thinking, okay? So when we write something out ourselves, it helps us to think through it in a more sophisticated way. It aids with critical thinking skills to help you after that, okay? In ways that something else doing it for you does not. So it sort of cuts out that critical thinking process that's so critical to learning, okay? All right, so that's everything for now on generative AI. And I look forward to seeing your writing this week. Have a great week. I'll see you online.